I want to first express my gratitude both to Mary Grace and to Denise for moving her original date. When I found out that Denise was going to present to the Mastery Circle, I didn't realize that Denise knew Mary Grace. And I had the real honor of being on the dissertation committee for Denise Maratos. And she endures as a icon in my neighborhood in Santa Monica. I miss Denise and I miss Santa Monica since moving to Santa Cruz. And so when the opportunity came for Denise to speak today, I was really grateful and honored again that she would come in and talk with us. She's a brilliant scholar, a wonderful woman, mother. I love her kid. I love her husband. They've been in my home many times. And she wrote her dissertation about extraordinary experiences. And we think about extraordinary experiences as being extraordinary, but in reality, they're really a part of the daily fabric of life. So let's listen to Denise, Dr. Denise Maratos, and she's brilliant and warm and wonderful. And Denise, I'm really grateful you're with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dana. Can everybody hear me? Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to show while I am presenting that will help explain the topic. And I will not be monitoring the chat during this time. I will be taking questions or comments at the end, if that's okay. So thank you for this invitation to present to your Mastery Circle today. It's been a pleasure listening to the past hour. I feel really at home here, and I just wanted to add that. I'm so happy that I'm here, and I'll be presenting on the subject of extraordinary experiences. So this is a research that was, let's see, how do I go to the next slide? Okay, this is a research that was part of my doctoral dissertation, as Dana mentioned, and Dana was one of my readers. It's dedicated to psychiatric survivors. It's also dedicated to my dearest mentor, Dr. Paula J. Kaplan. And she was a fierce scholar, advocate, and activist, a clinical and research psychologist who died 2 summers ago while she was on my dissertation committee. So she didn't get to finish my dissertation with us. She has many websites and books that you can look up if you are so inclined. The research question was, what is the experience of individuals who experienced extraordinary states of consciousness and have been diagnosed with a psychiatric label? So I asked about the individual's experiences themselves and hoped to discover what they felt in their own words, and if there was any healing or transformation involved. So one might ask, what are extraordinary experiences? And they have been termed in various ways by various scholars and academics and researchers. And so all these terms and many more are part of what we call extraordinary experiences. So we see here we have bliss, cosmic consciousness, mystical experience, extreme states, non-ordinary states of consciousness, numinous, religious, spiritual experiences, transpersonal experiences, transcendent experience. We also have psychosis, bipolar, or schizophrenia. And I'm mentioning this because this research also talks about the psychiatric part of this extraordinary experience. We also have near death and spiritual emergency, and what others might use in their descriptions, because each extraordinary experience is so unique. So I allowed the participants to express themselves in their own words, and you will see their own words during this presentation. The purpose of this study was to share the experiences in the participants' own voice and to explore the meanings they found in these experiences. It was to examine the impact psychiatric diagnoses and labels had on individuals and to understand the harm done to people when they are diagnosed and labeled. It was to bring awareness to health professionals and to the public about the variety of experiences and about the language used to describe people and their experiences. To learn about how to embrace human distress and suffering as a part of life, growth, and health. So I had to include the relevance for clinical psychology, and that is to acknowledge that each culture has its own sense of reality, and most people have various beliefs of reality that transcend everyday experiences. Thus, people may question what is pathology in accordance with their reality. What is, quote, sane? What is, quote, insane? What is, quote, pathological? And is this acceptable in their culture? While mental health professionals may not intend harm, diagnosing an individual with a psychiatric label may affect the course of their life by altering beliefs about their identity, personality, and sense of self. This study investigates how extraordinary experiences, as well as their associated clinical interpretations, diagnostic labels, and psychotherapeutic interventions influence human development. And it also examines the language, the diagnostic language, used by mental health professionals today, and how it influences an individual's cultural and personal beliefs. So, of course, I had to describe my own experience, and this is how I was interested in the topic. Ever since I had my first extraordinary experience, about at the age of 23, that was in 1996, I knew I had to share it. I knew I had to do something about it. I knew I had to guide others through it and serve in some way. And my initiation started, like I said, when I was 23, when I was lost at sea. And I experienced a near-death experience, followed by a mystical experience, including channeling from divine realms. Like this language came through me. And I understood parts of it because my first major was psycholinguistics. So I took a lot of languages, but I didn't recognize this language. I didn't know where it was coming from. I just knew that it was divine. There was nothing evil about it. It was all good. And but my experience ended in a spiritual emergency. And we can go into what a spiritual emergency is at the end. A couple of years before this happened to me, which is significant, I was working in a locked county facility in Santa Cruz. And I was a college student then at UC Santa Cruz. And I was trying to help my clients by listening to them and hearing their stories, but it was hard for me to relate when I couldn't see or hear what they were experiencing. And I asked for clarity. I asked to see and hear what they were experiencing. And a couple of years later, I was given this opportunity. And I'm calling it an opportunity, even though this viewing of the collective unconscious was both full of bliss and full of terror. Today, I'm standing here to share the stories that are similar, but very different than mine. I feel it is my obligation to humanity to fulfill this calling. By ignoring this calling and working elsewhere during my life, it was just coming up again and again. So I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't just stay. I used to be a teacher and work in higher education, but I couldn't stay in that field anymore. I had to study psychology and start sharing. So of course I had to do a lit review, and I'm not going to go into that because we don't have the time. But this is all free online to read, and I will give you the reference at the end. But the Lit Review explored psychiatric perspectives, philosophical perspectives, multicultural perspectives, individual perspectives, and personal accounts from history and the current day, and the influence of the culture of psychiatry and psychotherapy. And the method I use is called interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA, which is a qualitative approach, and it focuses on the individual's experience rather than the general population. It's all about the participants. So the focus of today is to share and honor the stories of 8 people that agreed to participate and share their innermost thoughts and feelings about their experiences. So what I'm asking for you is to just, for the next 10 minutes, that you have the eyes to see beyond your visible reality. And I ask for you to really sink in and imagine what it would be like for you to look through their eyes. In order to participate in this study, I asked for the participants to be at least 35 years old. Their experience had to be a non-drug induced experience. And I asked that their first experience, because some had many, but I asked that their first experience must have happened at least 10 years ago. And I did this because it's different when you had an experience 2 or 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And it's probably constantly changing as we all evolve. So I'm going to go over the themes that came up. These are the 6 themes, and I'll go through each of these. I will pause on each of them, and I will read you the quotes rather than going into theory. I might read a little bit of theory, but I will focus on the participants' quotes because that was the essential part of this research, was to present their own words verbatim. Trauma, stress, and/or illness is the first theme. And it can be viewed as an influential phase of the individuation process. The individuation process is described by Jung as distinguishing one's own ego from the grander personal self. Although this may include traumas and hurts of childhood being re-experienced, and it may cause fear and pain in acute episodes, intense activation of the deep psyche may be eventually helpful in the reintegration and healing of the psyche. So Shane said, I had gone through the confusion around my parents' divorce, which sent me abroad in the first place, and I was trying to find a home for myself. I think the stress of that probably opened up some things. I think the divorce of my parents created a split in ordinary reality because both had opposing values and beliefs that I had to suspend those kinds of conventional beliefs and perceptions of reality. Sandrine. About 1.5 years before that, I had a lot of personal stress. My mother had died. It was all of that stress with the death of my mom, then being laid off, and then thinking I was going to be laid off again. If I am stressed out, I am more prone to go into one of these states or another. And that's another thing that I've been able to manage more effectively over the last 10 to 15 years through meditation and learning more about psychic meditation classes and basically about managing energy. The second theme expressed itself through various experiences that participants described as an initiation into oneness within the world. It may be comprehended as the ego's response to a higher consciousness and transcendent quality of the self, as Jung would describe. While losing all sense of ego can be frightening, and even dangerous in many instances, this identification with oneness was often experienced as an encounter with a sacred realm. It was also described as living within an imaginal realm, which also contained myth. Experiences like these are known to have occurred since the beginning of time. And in fact, shamanic initiation is often associated with having such an experience. This is a quote from Jeanette. I feel like I'm connected with what I would call, or what a person would call God, or like the oneness of everything. My first experience was when I was 20. I went into this spontaneous kind of altered state of reality, that I was connected with everything, like the trees and the sky and the earth. I didn't feel a division, that I was separate from anything. And I felt that it was like an experience of what you would call God. In that experience, of course, it was hard to think about other things that I was supposed to be paying attention to, like eating or sleeping. Those experiences were beyond things that were necessary to do, like things that mattered. I was kind of a way beyond that. In other words, experiencing an altered state of reality that I call God. I felt like I had encounters with Christ, a Christ figure. Everything seemed to have meaning, and everything seemed to be way more intense. I actually did feel that I had powers to heal and of being able to be a Christ figure. This quote is by Ozzy. I would describe the experiences as spiritual, beautiful at times, difficult at times. For me, visions, a lot of visions. So sometimes I describe them as dreaming while you are awake. There were times where I felt like I was really connected to God or to a higher power, or just connected to everything, not separate, but a part of everything, just being a beautiful part of the experience. While the third theme, identification with the archetypal realms, may be seen as dangerous and unrealistic experiences of inflation, this is what we call in the Western biomedical model as manic, quote, manic states. And it is a state where the ego dissolves. We could call it ego death. And this may occur by identifying with the greater archetypal features of the self, otherwise known as imago Dei, as Jung and Edinger would say. And these are numinous experiences, encounters with archetypal realms. So this is a quote by Hope. I used to sleep with a nightlight on, like that regular kid stuff. And there was no door to shut there, so I couldn't just shut it and comfortably go to the bathroom. I started after a while, all of a sudden, seeing visions of Jesus standing in front of the door to my basement with his arms outstretched, wearing a white robe. And he was a European version of Jesus, which I know was just given to me because that was the place I was at in my cultural conditioning and upbringing. And it provided a great source of comfort for me. So I got to the point where I would see that vision on a regular basis from the time that I was about 8 or 9 years old until I left the house. I would wave to the bottom of the staircase and I'd say, "Hey, King Jesus, how's it going?" And give him a peace sign or just say hi. And I would feel this overwhelming amount of peace. Here's a quote by Renata. I'd finished my hatha yoga practice and my pranayama, and I was meditating. And suddenly I began noticing all of the sounds outside and in the room next door. And they became louder and louder. And they eventually just merged into this pulsing sound that just collected above me, like a cloud of honey and love. And I was just drenched. And I felt altered for a few days after that, but not dissociated. It was definitely some sort of a kundalini opening. I began perceiving tones in the solfeggio frequencies, and they began repeating and repeating. And then progressively, I began noticing sounds in the environment. And it basically sounds like hundreds of people singing, like a celestial choir in a cathedral or a cave. It's about a 5-octave melody, and I've tried to figure it out on my keyboard, but I can't. I don't know enough music. I guess to this day, I wonder. This feels to me to be a numinous experience, that is the presence of something in or on another plane. I've researched it quite a bit. It could have something to do with the heart chakra, the Anahata chakra, which in yoga, when it opens, it also changes. The fourth theme emerged when participants were asked to explain whether they were labeled with a psychiatric diagnosis. All 8 participants explained their experiences in their own words, using some medical terminology as well as alternatives to the biomedical language. Some of the phrases and terms they preferred were spiritual experiences, transpersonal states, numinous experience, altered states, peak experience, bliss, mystical experience, and we'll see some of them further down. Jane says, it felt extremely inaccurate and frustrating because they weren't exploring what was going on with me. They were finding what box I could fit into. It was disheartening, just so disheartening to know that they weren't at all interested in exploring what really went on with me. But they were very confident of their diagnosis. I am going to say the invalidation, the lack of validation was harmful because I just felt that as a human, I was dismissed. And Ozzy said, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. So, I can only speak for me. I know other people have a different experience with it. But for me, it felt like I was being thrown out of the human race. That there were so-called normal people, and there are people who are sick or mentally ill. And now, because of one experience in my life, I was in the sick category. I would be in the sick category for the rest of my life. So yeah, it felt horrible. This is a quote by Renata. It was absolutely horrible. The therapist I was seeing just after the most recent episode referred me to a psychiatrist who I thought I had hoped to talk to him about this. I thought he might be interested. And he just very coldly said, well, I can give you something to make it go away, as if the hallucinations were caused by some schizophrenia. I really felt like a specimen in a strange way. I remember one day sitting in his office and he was just looking at me. And I was really shocked and disappointed. And I said, I didn't want anything. I didn't want to take any more drugs. This is a slide where we see the psychiatric label given to the participants on the left-hand side. This psychiatric label is given by mental health or medical professionals, usually to bill insurance. So most people who have insurance and need to get their therapy paid for have to have a diagnosis, unfortunately. And this diagnosis comes from the book called the DSM. It's significant to note the language they preferred. So we'll go over some of these. You can see that Hope described her experience as life transformative, spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, sanctification. Lay described her experience, spiritual experience, transpersonal, existential crisis. Ozzy described his experience as a mystical experience, transpersonal state, unresolved trauma, spiritual, connected to God or a higher power, connected to everything, near-death experience, vision quest. Sandrine described her experiences as a particular set of sensitivities, hyper-associativeness, a kind of knowing and intuition, clairvoyant, psychic energy, psychic abilities, spiritual awareness, spiritual experiences. So we see that the labels on the left and the diagnoses are so stigmatizing, and the language that they preferred, it's purely enlightening and transformative. The fifth theme that came into the research was stigma and discrimination. Some participants experienced stigma intermingled with discrimination, while others were accepted in their family and society. So discrimination and stigma refers to the unjust or hurtful treatment of certain individuals or groups as a result of prejudice. Hope said, if I had had a single person in my family or in the medical community stand up for me, one person who would be on my side, because I literally have been told by my family, including my husband, look, we've got doctors who can verify you've got a file. You've got a file, Hope. You've got a file and you've got a label. Who's in your corner, Hope? Who believes that there are spiritual experiences? Who believes, Lord, the great hope is having spiritual experiences? And I'm like, I'm not the great hope. I'm a human, and humanity is, I believe, in the midst of a dark night of the soul. And now humanity on earth is experiencing a global spiritual shift and awakening. So this is a perfect example of stigma and discrimination in the family. This next one is a different example. This is Sandrine. So I remember I was sharing one of those things with my therapist, and I was trying to test her to see, because I was perfectly comfortable with it by that time. I've gotten into a habit where if a song is playing in my mind, I look up the lyrics online and see if there's a kind of anything further than the lyrics. Well, one of the lyrics in that song talks about something on the red line, like danger on the red line. And when I was going to work that morning, I was on the red line, and it was delayed for 20 minutes because there was something that happened up ahead. Stuff like that happens to me all the time, and I laugh about it, and I thought it was funny. And my therapist, she said, I'm worried. I think you're heading for another breakdown. Wow, that was in 2014, and I have not had another breakdown. And that was my last session with her. So here we see what can happen when a client, a patient, or a service user may feel unheard or even stigmatized by the therapist. And what she was experiencing in Jungian terms is a synchronicity. And she would experience these synchronicities frequently. But the therapist panicked. And here we see an example of the therapist's anxiety coming to the surface. The last theme that came up was compassion, humility, and meaning making. And this emerged from the data as the ego developing a significant relationship with the greater self, discovering meaning during the dark moments of life and accepting the suffering, while also connecting it to the larger self is significant in the process of initiation rites, of death and renewal, otherwise known as rebirth or reawakening, describes Campbell. So Shane said, I discovered my own personal myth, as Jung would see it. So in essence, it was like my own little red book, where I would come back in and pull on the key learnings of Jewish mysticism. And I felt very invested in the mysticism. I felt like I really did have some serious breakthroughs. I felt like other people had seen the images and they supported that. Some people I work with, they can't see it. I call it cognitive dissonance. Unless they believe that it's possible for these things to happen, they are not going to see it. Whereas other people may be more mystically oriented and have a more open mind. And Ozzy said, within the experience, everything had a lot of meaning, and I remember most of what happened. So I've been able to journal all about it and process it. When you're in those states, everything is deeply meaningful. I actually had a fear that I would lose all this meaning and beauty if I get out of the state, and I'm going to forget. But I didn't forget, and I found ways to access it without getting lost in it. They've shaped who I am. Indigenous people will go on vision quests. Those can be the most important experiences of their lives and define them and their life. I feel like I went through an unguided vision quest, 3 unguided vision quests, but I don't see them as different in quality from someone who does that on purpose and has a professional shaman who assists them. I was just going through it and I had no guidance at all. I felt like I have a similar calling to those who integrated that, and I used that to become a healer myself. Here are some of the findings and clinical implications that I found in this research. The importance of people expressing their experience in their own language, integrating the experiences, at times rejecting medication or treatment and finding meaning in doing so. And the importance for family and community support, which gives people a sense of belonging and the opportunity to share personal stories while supporting each other and integrating their experiences, and having open-minded and culturally competent health providers that can be really key to normalizing experiences while also finding acceptance, compassion, and not being pathologized or mocked. So one may argue that the participants in this study experience various stages of the individuation process and have integrated what Jung would say their complexes. This is significant as it may be an alternative to the current diagnostic pathologizing model that we are using today. And today we label these experiences as psychoses or schizophrenias as untreatable unless one is medicated and monitored for the rest of their life. The future recommendations that I proposed was to publish more firsthand stories, to examine the harm done, not only by pathologizing human distress and suffering, but by medicating it, to transform existing perspectives, to apply trauma-informed attitudes to comprehend human distress, to help clinicians overcome their own anxieties about trauma, regardless of the depth of darkness contained in it, to use person-centered language, phrases and words from the people they are treating, and not the stigmatizing, pathologizing language, and to change the ways in which society views human distress and suffering. And so I ask these questions to you today. I ask, could what we call mental health be the capacity to suffer? And could what is called mental illness be the flight from suffering? Embracing distress and going through suffering can lead to health. So why is our culture so set on not suffering? And I'll end with this last quote by one of my favorite psychiatrists, R.D. Lane, who wrote The Politics of Experience and the Bird of Paradise. And I'm going to read it because I think it's really deep. If the human race survives, future men, I suspect, will look back on our enlightened epoch as a variable age of darkness, the laughs on us. They will see that what we called schizophrenia was one of the forms in which, often through quite ordinary people, the light began to break through the cracks of our all too closed minds. Madness need not be all breakdown. It may also be breakthrough. The person going through ego loss or transcendental experiences may or may not become, in different ways, confused. Then he might legitimately be regarded as mad. But to be mad is not necessarily to be ill. notwithstanding that in our culture, the two categories have become confused. From the alienated starting point of our pseudo-sanity, everything is equivocal. Our sanity is not true sanity. Their madness is not true madness. The madness of our patients is an artifact of the destruction wreaked on them by us and by them on themselves. Let no one suppose that we meet true madness any more than we are truly sane. The madness that we encounter in patients is a gross travesty, a mockery, a grotesque caricature of what the natural healing of that estranged integration we call sanity might be. True sanity entails, in one way or another, the dissolution of the normal ego. And so I'm leaving this time that is left for questions and answers. And if anyone in this group has experienced any of these states of extraordinary experiences, or however you would like to describe them, it would be nice to hear your shares today. Thank you so much.
Denise, maybe you'd want to go back from the screen share so that we can see
Yes.
everything.
Okay, yes, stop share. Thank you. Do you want me to call on participants, Mary Grace?
Samuel has a question.
And
Samuel?
then Thomas Griggs.
I don't have a question. I have an experience to share. What you just presented is a validation of my entire life.
Yeah.
In 71, when I went to UCLA in my junior year, experimental college, I changed from being an atheist. I was turned on to yoga, tai chi, and meditation. And my life turned upside down. And I said, God, please take me through this as quickly as possible. Even if you have to put me on the roller coaster. I want to get out of this insanity. The world's crazy. And I got my wishes 2 years later when I graduated from UCLA. I went into a deep depression and I went into psychosis. And for 10 years, I was hospitalized every year for 3 weeks to 2 months, followed by 6 months of depression. And then I had to rebuild my life from scratch. And then I had to get a job and make new friends. And creation, destruction, 10 years of that. Till I got tired of it. I said, I don't want to live this way anymore. I don't want to take my lithium anymore. I'd rather die. And I came out of it. And I have my sanity because I worked for it. And you just validated that whole process. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing. Mary Grace?
I'm also so very grateful for your work, Denise, and thank you so much for sharing with the group. In 1996, I had my world turned upside down also. I'm very grateful that I did know not to go to psychiatry. I would have been medicated for sure, most likely hospitalized. And I was fortunate enough to have people around me that took care of me because I couldn't function for quite a while. I fast forward to now, I'm so grateful for it. But it was definitely what, Stan Groff calls that spiritual emergency. Anyway, I'm just incredibly grateful. Sam has been a huge part of my journey because he really validated my visions and the voices and the experiences I had. And he just kept saying, they're real. They're real. Don't dismiss them. They're real. And then I had 2 Jungian analysts that were just lifesavers and turned things around for me. So I did it without medication or hospitalization because of the support that I had. So I am so very grateful and appreciate the work that you're doing. There's so many of us that need the approach that you're talking about.
Thank you, Mary Grace. Thomas?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Denise. I have 2 comments. One is from the clinical psychology side of the fence and the other's from the personal side. Back in the, I noticed that you're describing people that had, in general, a positive spiritual experience. And my first introduction to this back in the 70s, R.D. Laing was one of our heroes back then under the radical psychiatry movement. I was working at a Locke Psychiatric Hospital in Berkeley, and I met a psychiatrist whose specialty was sorting out whether people had a mental illness or whether they'd had a psychic emergency experience. And some of those folks didn't have the context or the support to interpret what had happened to them. And so they didn't know how to advocate for themselves. And they bought the psychiatric diagnosis. And so they didn't have a positive experience. Some of them were terrified by what they'd gone through. So I'm adding that into the conversation. I don't, because they also are hurt by the wrong diagnosis, I'd say. And I also had a client who came in and needed to know if she could trust me about revealing that she knew things were going to happen before they happened. And that led me to get a consultation from Helen Palmer up in Berkeley about the boundaries between psychology and psychic practice, which helped shape my life and my practice. But the other side of it, the personal side, and this is not about a psychic emergency, this is about the DSM. And I'm really glad you tagged that, because I rejected the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder because it described my children and me as being deficient and disordered. And it's the same damage, only it's not an episode, it is chronic, and it is absolutely damning. And I rejected those diagnoses in favor of Tom Hartman's view of attention difference as a cultural phenomenon. And I wrote a paper called Who Labels My Child? And basically it depends on who shows up first, what authority shows up to describe what's going on. And I see you totally get that. So I think the work that you're doing is priceless and valuable. And I'm really, really glad that you're championing this domain. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I'd like to add, Thomas, that a lot of these experiences, including mine, did have terrifying moments and just terrifying moments that not just, seeing the positive and the oneness, but also the underworld. And maybe I didn't put enough of those quotes in because we were limited in time. But if I can send everybody the PowerPoint and the full dissertation, which is available online for free also.
Excuse me, Denise.
Thank you.
There are 2 people that want to make comments. Can you make them briefly? We need to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes. Sarah?
Yes, thank you, Denise. This is a very important and timely research. So thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and for sharing it. As somebody who's had a lot of these kinds of experiences, and I research transformative experiences related to dreams myself, and I am the last person to advocate for medication. I think from personal experience, what medication gave me was a break and an opportunity to process what was happening. And that was very important. And I only took medication for 6 months. but it was a tremendous opening and break so that I can move forward and I can process what was happening and I can find the right treatment and path to healing, if you can call it that. And I also think that labels and diagnosis can also be sometimes very helpful because they can put us on the path to healing and recovery. The challenge is, as you pointed out, that they're tied to insurance and our definitions are too narrow. And and I'm also reminded of a quote by Jung that I want to read. It's a short quote really quick that says, "The main interest of my work is not with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy. And in as much as you attain the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology. Even the very disease takes on a numinous character." So, thank you.
Thank you. Ruth?
Yes, Denise, that was really an extraordinary presentation. Thank you. I wanted to just share briefly that when I was growing up, I had my first out-of-body experience when I was about 5 years old. And there was no one I could talk to about it. First of all, I didn't have the words, and I didn't think there was another soul in the world that would understand anyhow. And I was consumed with this idea about something else happening that I was privy to, but I knew that there was an explanation. And when I was in college, I discovered the work of J.B. Rhine at Duke University, who was doing scientific experiments with parapsychology. And I even thought I was going to leave my university and go there and study with him. I didn't do that, but I was so relieved because I found literature going back to the 1800s of people who described these experiences. And I started to feel finally that I wasn't alone, and that there was an explanation for that. And I was part of a secret society that it was okay, and then I noticed that I was able to have psychedelic experiences without taking drugs, of altered realities, of colors. The way people would describe an acid trip was the kind of experience that I would have on my own. And so, I'm not surprised that there's so many people in this group that are describing this, because there is something about this group that lends itself to being an understanding ear. And so I thank you and I bless you for your work.
Thank you, Ruth, for sharing. Thank you.
That was really extraordinary, Denise. I knew it would be, and boy, it was. Thank you so much.
Thank you.